Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Justify Product Investments with Impact-Based Research, which is sponsored by ProQuest. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few features of the webinar software. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation material. Along the left-hand side, you will see a chat panel that you can use to submit questions or comments. We will spend some time responding to your questions during the program, so please feel free to submit these throughout. You will also see a separate box for technical questions. Please feel free to use this feature for any technical difficulties you may be experiencing, so our production team can troubleshoot them privately. And finally, please note that today's program will be recorded and all registrants will receive follow-up instructions on how to access the archived version. Our speaker today is Dr. Eric Meyer. Dr. Meyer is an associate professor and the director of graduate studies at the Oxford Internet Institute, a multidisciplinary department within the Social Sciences Division of the University of Oxford. It was established in 2001 to better understand life online and the societal impact of the Internet. Dr. Meyer's research focuses on shifts in work, knowledge creation, and interactions when digital technologies replace their previously non-digital counterparts. Study topics have included digital library collections, data sharing in dementia research, the use of digital images in biology, digital information practices in the sciences and humanities, and uses of data for public policy. His research, involving over 20 projects, has been funded by a range of organizations, including ProQuest and Jisc, the Sloan Foundation, the Health Foundation, UK's ESRC, Nesta, and others. At this point, we're ready to get started, so I will turn the floor over to you, Dr. Meyer.
Thank you very much, Mark. And also thanks to ProQuest for sponsoring this webinar, and of course to ACRL Choice for inviting me to do this webinar. And I'd also like to mention Jisc, who some of you may know, the UK information agency, I don't know exactly how to describe them, that funded some of the research that we're talking today in conjunction with ProQuest. So I very much appreciate everyone taking time out of their day today to hear what I've got to say about the impact of digital collections. Before I get started on the main body of what I'll be talking about today, let me just mention one or two things about the sort of background of this. So first of all, as you heard from Mark, I'm based at the Oxford Internet Institute, which is a department at the University of Oxford. Some of you may or may not have heard of the Oxford Internet Institute. We're quite an unusual place in that we're an academic department, but we're extremely multidisciplinary. We're interested in understanding how the Internet's changing the world. So we've got people ranging from physicists and mathematicians to computer scientists to social scientists to also people in the more digital humanities space. My own personal background, my PhD, well, my master's and bachelor's degrees are in anthropology, but my PhD is in information science from what used to be called the School of Library and Information Science at Indiana University. It's now part of the School of Informatics and Computing. So I've been interested in library resources in a number of ways for a long time, and this project is one of the sort of the latest in a long series of projects that was trying to understand some of the impact digital collections have been having in different domains. So let me go ahead and advance to the first slide and talk a little bit about a resource that we've set up called TIDSR, Toolkit for the Impact of Digitized Scholarly Resources. And there's a bit.ly address on there that you can get to if you want to go directly to the TIDSR site. You can also Google it. It's the only result that comes up if you use Google for TIDSR. It started out back in 2008, and it was the result of a funding call by Jisc at the time to understand something about all the investments that they've been making in digital resources. So in the early 2000s, as many of your libraries I'm sure are also involved in, the Jisc organization had funded mass digitization projects in a number of areas, and they were trying to understand whether anybody was using these resources, what the impacts of these resources were. And in our bid for being able to do that first piece of work, we proposed setting up this toolkit that other people could then also go in and understand the impacts of their own digital collections. As it turns out, that initial project that looked at five different digitized resources that I won't come into today, had a longer lifespan in some ways than the original impact project, because digital still exists. You can go use it today, and a number of projects have used it over the years. We've updated it a number of times, and you can, if you go under how to use this toolkit and some of the case studies, you can see examples there of other people who've used the toolkit. So we originally wanted to test a variety of methods, both quantitative and qualitative. Now, thinking back to 2007 when we set this up, there wasn't a very sophisticated understanding by most resources of different ways that you could understand the impacts of resources. So a few people had Google Analytics set up, but a lot didn't even have that. So they were looking at simply raw downloads or accesses to their web page from the web, which isn't a very useful number. So what the teacher toolkit was designed to do is to say, look, you can actually use a lot of different measures, both quantitative and qualitative, in order to try to understand the kinds of digital collections you might have in your library, in your organization, and how people are using them. So we've got things in there like interviews and so forth, and this resource is set up so that anybody could use it. It's not a tool you download and run on your computer. It's just a set of methods and short instructions for how to use these methods. One thing before I sort of get into the most recent study that I think I found interesting in a second phase of that project, after we set it up, Jisc funded then 7 other projects to use the tools with only minimal support from us. They were largely going off on their own, using some of these tools to measure the impact of resources. And a lot of the librarians, largely librarians doing this, who found that it was really a fun exercise to better understand who was using their collections. They just didn't have the time before they had this bit of project funding to sit down and think, well, who is using our resources, and what could we do to try and better understand how we're using those. I think it's something that most people haven't had time to sit down and do. Also, I remember one very interesting quote from one of the people who used it was, and this is the first time I've ever studied any people that can actually talk back to me. I'm used to studying history and people who have only been at the long distance of history and can't talk back to what I'm doing, but now I'm studying my users and the people who use my resources, so that's something new for me. So if you'd like to go look at that resource at some point, I'd encourage you to do so. I don't know if there's anything, I've noticed a few comments about the audio quality. Is there anything that you need to do about that?
No, just feel free to continue on, and we're going to make sure to make the adjustments necessary. Okay.
I don't want people to miss out on the whole talk if the sound quality isn't good enough. So I've got a link here if you want to follow along with the latest report that we've written. This is a study on the impacts of digital collections, early English books online, and House of Commons parliamentary papers that was funded by Jisc and ProQuest. If you go to that bit.ly link /2016-IDC, you can access the report either now or after the call. And again, apologies if you're having trouble hearing this because I am on Skype from the UK. And apologies if that makes it hard to hear. I don't have many other options to go to. Okay, so let me dive right in, and hopefully the audio quality picks up as we go. So EEBO and HCPP in the UK is what the focus of this particular project was. Some of you or many of you are probably familiar with these two resources: early English books online, a huge resource, 130,000 titles printed before 1700, and includes 25,000 community rekeyed works available in text via the Text Creation Partnership available via open access, EEBO TCP. We also looked at House of Commons parliamentary papers, which has over 3 centuries of official government documents going from the 18th to the 21st century, and it's a collaboration it also includes a collaboration between Jisc and Bachkrit that we previously studied in 2008 to include the 18th century papers, but these have now been wrapped up into the bigger House of Commons parliamentary papers collection. So the question that Jisc and ProQuest had was, who's using these two resources in the UK? What can we understand more about these resources? And what can we do in order to enhance the uptake of these resources? I'll try backing up from the speaker and seeing other comments. Okay, so what we're going to go through today is just some highlights from the report. You see on the top this is highlight 1, and there's 10 highlights, and we'll focus on those, but then we'll go off into a couple other little things from the report. And these are all available in the tail end of the report. Now, highlight 1 talks about the context of the use of digital resources is changing, but these changes are incremental and have a long development cycle prior to the realization of impact. I think the most important thing that we've had to stress over the years when we've done these kinds of studies with a lot of different resources is that you can't expect to put up a digital resource and know exactly how it's being used in the first 3 months, 6 months, even the first couple of years. Some of the things that we've been looking at over time, EEBO we've actually looked at on a number of different occasions, and we get additional information each time we look at it several years down the road. So if you are thinking about measuring digital resources via some of the techniques we'll talk about today, the thing to remember is you need to think in long cycles, 6 months, a year, not on a weekly basis or a monthly basis, because there's too much up and down in the uses of these things that it's quite evident in the download data, the usage data, and everything else. Now, the second highlight is about the usages of early English books online in the House of Commons parliamentary papers, and they've been increasing over the past decade. So these two charts, again, both from the report, are relying on data from ProQuest and Jisc to look at EEBO volume, which is measured in page views from 2004 to 2015, and this is UK volume. And then House of Commons parliamentary papers volume, which is full text access. And now the reason it's slightly different measures for these two is that there's different data available in the database, and the specifics of what you're able to measure is slightly different because of choices in how the database measures things. So you can't measure the same thing with both databases and actually have it count the same things. Also, there were some rather strange technical issues a couple of years ago that a couple of major libraries changed the way that they were accessing these resources, and so it looks like there were huge spikes that are disappearing when we actually use this measure. But if you look at the trend there, you can see that it increases from 25,000 page views a month for EEBO in 2004 to something more like 150,000 page views per month in 2015. And that's a relatively steady climb over that same time period. And likewise for HCPP volume in the UK, increases from around 25,000 up to something over 50,000 per month. So what this tells us isn't that, oh, well, EEBO's use more than HCPP, therefore it's better. It doesn't tell us that at all. One of the things that we always want to be sure people think about is the difference between the sheer numbers and the fact that different resources have different audiences, and that you need to understand that the different audiences behave differently. And that'll become clear as we look at some of the other graphs and charts that I've brought with me today that are also available in the report. Now, we also wanted to look at who was using these resources across the UK. And this is one of the interesting findings that has, I brought a couple of maps today, but there's also some additional tables that are in the report that you can look at if you choose, that looked at researchers at top universities and other ranked universities around the UK to see who was more likely to use EEBO and HCPP. So on the maps there, you can see on the left, and throughout the report and throughout this talk, EEBO is shown in orange and HCPP is shown in blue when we've got data. And the EEBO subscribers, you can see, are across the UK, although they're slightly more concentrated than the HCPP subscribers. There's more subscribers, but they're also spread across the UK. We only looked at the UK in this instance. But we also have additional data that needs a bit of explanation, and that's why I didn't go and put it on the slide. We have this So in trying to understand the different qualities of institutions in the UK, we don't have something quite the same as the Carnegie classifications in the US. So we used something called the REF, which is the Research Excellence Framework, which was an exercise a couple of years ago to measure the research quality of different institutions across the UK. And we looked at institutions that were submitted to the English language part of the REF, so departments of English, and also history submissions to the REF. And we looked at the usage by the departments that were top ranked in this REF exercise, the middle rank, and the lowest ranked, and whether that could predict whether they were likely heavy users of EEBO and HCPP. And something interesting came out of this, which is that for the EEBO platform, being at a top-ranked institution was a really strong predictor of whether you were going to be using EEBO a lot. So the top-ranked institutions in the UK were also the top volume users of the EEBO resource. So we're talking about Oxford and Cambridge, but also a lot of other top universities that you know the name of around the UK, a lot of the London universities, but also Scottish universities such as Edinburgh, etc. The same holds true if we looked at EEBO for the history REF submissions. It was more likely that top institutions would use them than other institutions. But something slightly different happened when we looked at HCPP, which is that the resource usage was a bit more democratized insofar as the top-ranked English and history departments used HCPP a bit more than the others did, but it wasn't nearly so lopsided as with EEBO. So the kinds of uses that HCPP was being put to seemed to be spread more widely across institutions. Now, this really underscores one of the reasons why you can't use just a single measure, because that, of course, raises questions is, well, how are these being used differently? One of the things that is, there's a whole section of the report on some of the qualitative interviews that largely my collaborator on the project, Catherine Eccles, did, which was talking to people at a number of different kinds of institutions, top-ranked institutions, mid-ranked institutions, to figure out how they were using these resources. And we used some of the data that we got in this phase of the study to identify, say, middle tier or lower tier institutions in terms of the rankings that were still using these resources quite heavily to find out what they were doing with them. And for HCPP, for instance, there was a much heavier use, or particularly heavy use in the teaching realm, that a lot of people were using these at some of the institutions for teaching resources. They were using them in the classroom, they were using them in their history classes and so forth, in order to get their students access to primary materials rather than simply secondary materials. And that might be what you might guess, but it was something that became more apparent when we started to look at the data than what one was just guessing at. And I think that's one of the underlying ideas that we want to get across here, is that relying on evidence and data is something that we're always encouraging people to do in order to try and get beyond the guesswork in terms of whether people are using resources or not.
So Eric, this is Barb Olson.
Yes.
There's a question here in chat that I think is probably pertinent to what you're talking about. Teresa asks from Mexico City, how reliable are provider-generated usage statistics, and is there any hope that an industry standard will be developed?
That's a good question. I mean, we had two sources of statistics for most of these resources, which is data directly from ProQuest, which they were very willing to share with us because we were doing a research project with them, but also data from Jisc on the Jisc historic text platform. And so we were able to check these against each other, and we found that they were very consistent with one another in terms of the usage patterns. So I think that we had no reason to believe the data we were being provided by ProQuest was unreliable, because they, we did a lot of checks of these data. Now the challenge, of course, is that this data isn't openly available to everybody. You can't just go and download this through an API or anything like that. So it requires cooperation. I think this is one of the challenges. If you've got a resource that you're interested in, you've got to figure out the best place to get the data. You might have data inside your own organization, and we certainly worked with that before. One of the things that we didn't do so much in this project that we did otherwise is things like log file analysis. So if you've got an institution that's keeping log files with access to your documents, there's some interesting things you can do with log files to understand these uses that don't necessarily require then getting access to data from ProQuest, as an example.
And then there's just one other question before we move on, which I think would be good to level set, is what level of student is being introduced to these tools?
So to EEBO and HCPP, so we saw a real range of students from undergraduate level through graduate level. And this goes both in this study and also in previous studies. We found that one of the really big advantages that we were able to demonstrate in a lot of our reports through the qualitative research in particular is that students are able to get access to primary sources at a much earlier stage in their career. As you all know, if you've got a special collection with rare materials, it's highly unlikely that a second-year undergraduate is going to be allowed to access those things, versus if they've been digitized, you can show quite clearly across a variety of studies that second-year undergraduates and third-year undergraduates are able to access these primary resources, are using them in their classrooms for teaching and research and for writing their papers, which is really quite a big step change from even 10 or 15 years ago. So if I continue on to our highlight 4, one of the questions that publishers have is, how do researchers find the collections that they use regularly? Do they hear about them through word of mouth? Do they search for them? You know, this notion that everybody just searches Google for everything is part of the ethos. But we did a survey. You can see it's not huge, but N equals 238, that is geared more toward EEBO and HCPP subscribers particularly. And we asked them, and this is a repeat of a survey we've used on at least 4 or 5 occasions over the years, so we've got a bit of time series data elsewhere for this as well. And we find that researchers really heavily rely on specific digital collections that they go to regularly. And this is essentially, more largely skilled researchers, so we're not talking about undergraduates in this survey. It's graduate students, postdoctoral researchers, and of course faculty members and librarians and things like that. So rather than going out and saying, oh, I'm interested in a government doctorate from the UK, where do I find it? Most people in these disciplines know that House of Commons Parliamentary Papers is the place that you might want to go for that. And so they go directly to a resource like HCCP and access them. So they're going to these specific databases of collections, and they find that important in this survey sort of 97% of the time. We also do things like follow references, which again is an old behavior that hasn't changed at all in the digital era. The Google question there about Google and search engines being important, it is important, but it's a common thing that it is not quite as all-encompassing as some people fear it to be. We've written previously about sort of the Googleization of information, and the thing that we find is that people still rely heavily on the word of mouth, on the peers. In a previous study, one of the really key things that came out of it, looking at humanities researchers and also physical sciences researchers, was that the ways that people, if they had a new area that they didn't know anything about, they wanted to learn more about it, the most common way was that they went to somebody that they trusted and asked them, how do I find out more about this new topic? And that might be a librarian, it might be a colleague, it might be someone else that they know in their field across the world someplace, but they're often going to an expert rather than simply relying on Google. So I think that's a bit of a takeaway here in terms of not thinking that Google is the only way that people are finding things these days. Now, we also have been make the argument in this report that resource use in the humanities is extremely diverse, and that providing access to the needed resource and tools is really challenging. So there's a couple of tables in the report that just don't look good on screen because they would end up being so small. One of the questions we ask people in surveys is, what other resources do you find particularly useful? And the list goes on and on and on, and it's a lot of people with a lot of small n responses. So a few people use a lot of different resources. Again, probably not surprising to those of you who run libraries, because you know that people use quite a wide variety of things. But I think it underscores this notion that we can't just subscribe to a few killer resources and expect that that will cover everybody's interests. And so this data underscores that. So if you look at the top 30 subject classifications and theses, which I think also underscores this point, this is theses in the ProQuest dissertations database. We looked at theses that had some way of identifying EEBO as part of it, and some way of identifying the House of Commons parliamentary papers as part of it. The methods for that are in the paper. You can go look at the website, be happy to answer questions. And you can see the range of areas, the classifications that are attached to those theses that rely on EEBO or HCPP in some fashion. So some are not surprising. Certainly the top choice there under EEBO, British and Irish literature, isn't surprising. But the third one, theater, might be slightly. Religious history might also be slightly. And as you move down the list, you see some interesting things like art history and Romance literature, and even political science and law are using references to EEBO in the theses in those areas. And I think this diversity of use of a single resource is also something that's quite interesting to take on board in terms of how we might be able to understand who's using our collections. And if we look under House of Commons parliamentary papers, again, we see that not big surprises at the top of the list: European history, modern history, history. But then as we move down further, we can see economics is referencing House of Commons parliamentary papers, Caribbean studies, women's studies, art history, recreation, and so forth. So there are other kinds of uses coming out of these that are quite easily detectable. And this sort of data is available to anybody. If you've got a good search term for the resource you're interested in, anybody can access this through the ProQuest dissertations database. That's not proprietary information. We also looked here in highlight 6 at the citation evidence about these resources. Now this is a bit tricky in terms of publication and citation patterns in the humanities, as it's well known that citations in the humanities are slower than in, say, biology or physics, where we get very, very fast turnaround in citations. The citation windows in some studies that we cite in the report could be as long as 6 to 8 years before humanities articles reach their half-life, which is half of the total citations that they'll ever get. So you have to take what appears like a drop in citations in more recent years as a bit of a grain of salt, because those will almost inevitably increase as time goes on, as more people cite resources after publication window. After something gets published, it takes a while for them to get noticed and then cited, and those things get published and so forth. So this looked at EEBO-related publications in orange again, and House of Commons parliamentary papers-related publications in blue. And you can see there's an increase in the number of publications over the years. Again, this is slight drop-off that I'm not particularly worried about because the databases get updated and so forth. So we'll have to look in a couple of years whether these last little tailing off is true. I can say that for EEBO, when we did a similar study in 2012, it looked like 2012 had dropped off significantly from previous years, but of course now it looks like the peak. But this does take a while before these data are reliable. And then the citations to these, if you take out that sort of large peak of 742 in 2006, you can see that we have a general upward trend of people citing the papers that have used EEBO or HCPP in an identifiable way. Now I say in an identifiable way because it is a bit tricky to do some of these sorts of bibliometric studies with digital collections. EEBO is relatively easy because it's got a unique name, it's got a unique URL, it's relatively easy to find if somebody cited it in any way that it references the EEBO resource. But of course, a lot of people will use these and not give any indication it came from a digital resource at all. They will have used a resource from EEBO, they'll cite it as if they consulted the paper copy. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but it then makes the challenge of finding out whether anybody used a digital resource almost impossible to detect because it varies into people's citation habits. I could talk about that separately at the end if people are interested. We've done a lot of work about citation habits and changing citation habits. And then similarly with HCPP, again, not as sharp of an incline as EEBO, but there is a bit of growth and also a relatively steady rate of citations to publications that we can identify as using HCPP. Again, underscoring this point that HCPP is actually much harder to find in publications than EEBO because you can't just find the word House of Commons and expect that it refers to House of Commons parliamentary papers. You have to look for some more evidence that it actually used those digital collections, and that's quite difficult to find. Now, this is really important, and I wanted to point this out because some of you might find this interesting, which is where we got the publications for using 3 different sources. So we use Scopus, JSTOR, and Google Scholar. We could also use Web of Science, but it doesn't have as good a coverage in the humanities and the arts that would have really covered what EEBO and HCPP were doing. So there's quite a small N if we use Web of Science. We're looking at Scopus, JSTOR, and Google Scholar, which we used to get the bibliometric measures. You can see we had about 800 publications in for EEBO and 506 for HCPP that I'm showing here in this particular diagram. And the interesting part here is, well, yes, Google Scholar is bigger than the others. We know that about Google Scholar. It tends to pick up more citation, more resources than others, including gray literature and so forth. But I think the most interesting thing about this is the tiny amount of overlap between these three resources. So you can see that there's only 14 EEBO resources that actually showed up in all three, Scopus, JSTOR, and Google Scholar. And for HCCP, there's only 4 that showed up in all 3 of those resources. And then the other overlaps, the Venn diagrams show you things that showed up in more than one resource. I showed this to some of our students, and our students were a bit shocked by this and said, oh, wait a minute, that means if I'm relying completely on Google Scholar for my research, I'm really missing out quite a lot. I'm missing out everything that might be coming from these other resources. And likewise, if I only rely on JSTOR, I'm missing things that I might be getting that are relevant to my research using one of these other 2 databases or other databases beyond these 3 as well. So I think this is interesting to think about in terms of training people what the strengths and limitations of the various databases are. They need to know that they're not just completely interchangeable and would get necessarily the exact same outcome looking for evidence of use or just evidence of the publications you're looking for in these different databases.
Eric, we have another question from New York.
Yes.
The participant asking, what type of literature mentions these 2 databases? Is it mostly humanities or library sciences?
So this was, the previous subject classification thesis is pretty representative also of what we saw in the other publications. So it's in largely humanities fields, so history, English literature, British literature, things like that are the most common places that look at that. And this will, I think, also underscore that. So I think these next slides sort of answer that question as well. I can move on to them. So in highlight 7, we looked at the number and range of disciplines, which gets onto this question that refer to EEBO. And these diagrams here are a little intuitive, but I'll need to explain them so you can see what they're talking about. So you look at these, this big pile of gray dots. The underlying gray dots come from a method pioneered by someone called Jisc, who's based in the Netherlands, and he has built what's called a underlying map of science. So the dots are using all of the publications in Scopus in this instance. He also has similar ones for Web of Science. And so we'll look at all the publications in Scopus and which journals cite each other, and we'll build a map of which journals are close to each other and which ones aren't. And then we'll be able to have a baseline map just as if we had a map of the United States or Britain. And then if we're interested in particular topics, we can look at the publications on those topics and see where they're overlaid on this generalized map of science to see who's talking about this particular topic. So in EEBO and HCPP, you can see that there's a stronger concentration in the bottom left-hand corner, which is where the humanities and arts are. But also you can see that the uses, there are some small number of uses that extend outside of this sort of bottom left corner, which is the humanities disciplines, particularly for HCPP, which includes things up into energy policy, other kinds of policy areas, also some medical areas that are using custom common parliamentary papers. So there's other kinds of uses that are being put to HCPP, I'm getting myself confused saying that, that are detectable using these kinds of methods in order to understand the spread of knowledge. Now this is looking at the EEBO corner a bit more in detail. So you can see some of the kinds of journals that are publishing articles that include EEBO references within them. You'll probably be familiar with some of those. So as the previous question asked about librarians, there are some library fields in there that you'll recognize, but also a lot of things in the primary humanities disciplines. This is the top publication sources from the bibliometric data that we looked at. So studies of English literature have the most publications with 80. Google Books has quite a lot with 30. The interesting thing about studies of English literature is apparently nobody ever cites the things published in that. There's only 8 citations for those 80 publications. The most cited are publications in what was called literary linguistics computing. It's now got a new name that I'm unfortunately forgetting off the top of my head. Most of you probably know better than I do. It has 8 publications, but they've been cited a total of 87 times, so it averages nearly 11 citations per publication. So this gives you a sense of some of the areas. So you can see there's a mix of library publications coming from library quarterly and so forth, but also disciplinary publications that are in the humanities disciplines. Similarly, for House of Commons parliamentary papers, this is a zoom in on the bottom corner, showing you some of the journals that are using the House of Commons parliamentary papers in a detectable way. And then this shows some of the publication sources used there. So again, Google Books is the most publications. It also have quite a lot of citations, although those are limited to a couple of books in particular. The Journal of Economic History has relatively few articles, but they get cited quite a lot. And then a little range of some things that publish things that may or may not get cited more frequently than others. And they cover, again, the range of things like history and geography and other things. Now, the eighth highlight, and I'm getting near the end of my 35 minutes or so, and I can take more questions, is that researchers are really more concerned with the content and functionality of digital collections than strictly in who provides the access. One of the things that Jisc and ProQuest are obviously interested in is, well, the people care whether they get it from Jisc or ProQuest. With EEBO in the UK, you can either get access to a ProQuest subscription through your institution or through the Jisc historical text or through a variety of OMAC groups, through EEBO TCP, for instance. But largely we find that people don't care where it came from as long as they get access to it. And the impact of these things is quite clear. People say increasingly, I couldn't do my research without EEBO. In fact, I wonder how much of my research has been shaped by having EEBO, to be honest. So this reflectivity we get in the interviews, the people are thinking about the fact that the presence of these resources is really influencing the kinds of research they do. Now, this can be good or bad. We had an interview a number of years ago with someone who was worried about the fact that after the British Library digitized a lot of their newspaper content, it wasn't all of the newspaper content by any stretch of the imagination, it was a portion of it, that they suddenly started seeing very many more papers being submitted to some of the major conferences that relied on large analysis of newspaper content based on what was by chance or by design available in the British Library newspaper collection. And the worry was that, well, is this driving the research rather than the intellectual questions? And simply the presence of certain databases that encourages people to go there rather than going to the best resource, even if it's less convenient. And this is an ongoing concern in all sorts of areas. Highlight 9, I'll just cover briefly since we don't have too many British attendees here, I don't think, but it's important to note with Jisc in the UK, the UK is really quite unusual in providing national level access that goes across institutions through their national purchasing for resources such as EEBO and the House of Commons parliamentary papers. The Jisc has this banding model where you can buy access to these kinds of resources through Jisc and you get it at a variable rate depending on your institution. But Jisc does the negotiations of this on behalf of UK institutions, so they get a lot of bang for their buck. And the sense is that this really does contribute to some of the UK's global prominence in publications in a lot of these areas, not just in publications in these areas, but across the board. The UK regularly, in a lot of our studies, really bats above its weight in terms of the impact its research can be shown to have in a lot of different measures. And one of the ways that it does that is by having free access to these resources at the user point, at the point of user, not necessarily for the point of the institution is free, but from the user's point of view, it's free to them. And we're quite interested in understanding more about whether this has potential democratizing effects. We see some evidence of this, if you remember back to those maps, that some of the smaller institutions are definitely using things like both EEBO and House of Commons parliamentary papers that they probably wouldn't be able to justify based on the small number of users that they might have at their individual institution, but because they can get relatively affordable subscriptions through Jisc, this allows them to still provide it for the small number of users they do have, and so they're able to do things that they otherwise would be find impossible, or have to travel to a different library to be able to get this access to these resources. And then the final highlight 10, talks about the shifts to data-driven approaches in the humanities is really a growing interest to scholars. Most scholars don't really quite know what they should do in this area, but they sense that there's lots of data out there. Maybe they should be doing things more computational, they should learn more of the skills of digital humanities, and maybe they should be teaching this in their classrooms. So this quote here from one of the people that we interviewed about using primary sources in their teaching they really find it's a good way of getting students engaged. Students love to be engaged with these digital resources, and so I think a lot of the people that we talk to and have surveyed over the years are trying to find more creative ways of engaging these in their teaching, and some have done so, and we've got some examples of that floating around, but also others are struggling with knowing how to better do that. I think there's really a big desire to think of creative ways to incorporate these digital materials in their teaching, and I think we can try as organizations to think about how to enable that, because there is a growing interest in that. So essentially, to conclude, before I take some questions, digital collections have really become fundamental to modern scholarship. This is not just from this study, but from a series of studies we've been doing and others, our colleagues at other universities around the world have been doing. It's really something that can be shown to be fundamental, and that it's not something, if we turned off all the digital collections tomorrow, we would definitely seriously notice the impact on scholarship. You can download again here the summary. You can access it through digital or go directly to the SSR link there. I'd like to thank my colleague, Catherine Eccles, and also before I take questions, I'll just give a little bit of a blurb for my book that was published last year called Knowledge Machines, that covers many of these issues. It doesn't cover this particular study, because this study came after this book was published, but it covers related studies from the earlier periods when we studied some of these digital collections. When we talk about the digital transformations of the sciences and humanities in this book, Knowledge Machines, it's from MIT Press. So if you're interested in that, you can go take a look at that book. Maybe your library already has it. And I'd encourage, if anybody has any questions about that, they can contact me directly. So that's all I've got to say. I think I've kept to time. I would be happy to take your questions. I'd like to thank again Jisc and ProQuest for funding this work, and also to ProQuest and ACRL Choice for setting this up. Hopefully you're able to hear things okay, and hopefully you found it interesting, and I'll be happy to answer any questions now. So thanks very much.
Not seeing any additional questions in the chat box. If anyone has a question, you'd like to type it in, or I'm not sure, you can take yourself off mute and ask the question directly. You're welcome to do that.
Everybody's gone quiet. I mean, one of the questions I could ask the group is if anybody, I guess you don't have any ready way of answering, is how many, you've made a quote for this, I guess, how many people have done any sort of analysis of your resources in a systematic way, or if it's only, yeah, I guess that's the question, is how many have actually done any analysis of the resources in a systematic way? So I guess we're getting a quick question put up about that. Okay, so there you got a little quick vote. Okay, some interesting fluctuation there. So about half, it looks like, have done some sort of analysis in a systematic way, but no, slightly over half haven't, and a few saying not yet. I mean, one of the things that I would like to encourage is you to think about this. And actually, as I said at the very beginning, people do find this quite fun when they get started. I think that many of the places that we've worked with have found it a bit off-putting at first, like, oh, there's numbers involved, there's skills I don't necessarily know much about. But one of the things about the Tiddler toolkit is that it was largely written by, not only by myself, but my collaborator on it, Catherine Eccles. She's a sort of proper humanities person. She's got a PhD in history, or a DPhil in history from Oxford, and she's been working with me for a number of years now. She's also currently Oxford's Digital Humanities Champion. She really knows what humanities researchers think like, and she had no experience with any of these methods or tools when she was first hired to work on this project. And so most of the things that we set up were written so that someone who has no experience with these can get in, can start using some interesting new ways of measuring resources, and be able to come up with some interesting answers right away. So I would encourage people to start thinking about that. If you can start at a small level and you do a bit of work that doesn't require lots of time and start to play around with what you're able to measure, and then think about what that actually means for the resources you have. So I think this is something, because only a third of you have actually done this systematically, I would encourage more people to think about doing. Because it is quite rewarding for people who've done it. Anything else?
All right. If there are no additional questions, I will just step in here and take a moment to thank Dr. Meyer, and I'd like to offer him a virtual round of applause for spending some time with us today and for sharing really interesting information. I know I myself appreciate your insights and really enjoyed the presentation. So as a reminder for folks in the audience, we have recorded today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from ACRL and Choice that will include instructions on how to access the archived version. So thanks to all of you for participating with us today and for joining in the discussion. I hope you've enjoyed